So, Andrew, that was then, the United States considering invading 7 countries, as Peter points out. What is it like now? What has it changed to now? What is the war on terror now?
Well, we've definitely pulled back on, we're not crossing borders and toppling governments. Now we've got 4,000 or so troops in Iraq, 9,000 or so troops in Afghanistan, mostly in a supporting role, incidentally coming into combat, just in the sense that if you send trainers for firefighters and a fire breaks out, the trainers will help. But the war on terror I wouldn't even call it a war at this point, right? The Bush administration had a completely different vision. The war on terror was an excuse to turn Afghanistan into this experiment of dropping 250,000 troops in the middle of the Middle East and going country to country trying to remake that region. That seems to be over. Now it's targeted strikes against terror networks, SWAT teams, special forces operators dropping in to take out.
Because there again, the question arises, as you point out, targeted strikes. Look, we just had the leader of the Afghan Taliban was killed in a drone strike, Mullah Mansour. He was replaced the next week. So, what's the point?
I think that's a good question. I don't know how to what extent we're really disrupting and destroying these networks, right? As long as you have these large ungoverned regions, these wild lands where these organizations can hide or just actually not hide, right? Can prosper in these ungoverned regions. It's not clear how terrorism ends, how these organizations will end.
Right, and Tim, to what extent is the American public involved in this debate about this war on terror? Are Americans getting the full picture of what is going on? We know that in many instances the Pentagon has worked vigorously to prevent pictures of this war being transmitted around the world. In a sense, are the American people being denied the opportunity to have their voice heard in this war?
Yeah, I think that's correct. A lot of polling information suggests that the number of casualties that Americans think happened in Iraq is about 1/10 of the real number. And I think in that sense of being duped about the full impact of war, Americans have been duped by their leaders over the past several decades in Iraq in particular, but also in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and Syria, although the dynamic there is different. So I think it's very difficult for the American people to really understand what the impact of our military policy overseas is. And that's a real disservice, both on the part of the media, but also, of course, on the controllers of information. The Pentagon is famous for saying, we don't count civilian deaths. That is the cold reality that they are trying to promote, and really distorts the picture of the full impact of the wars.
Right, and Colin, if the intention of the war on terror was to reduce the threat, reduce the risk, reduce the danger, has that worked? Because if we look at Iraq, let's use Iraq as an example, we now have Islamic State, which is, as Andrew pointed out, occupied 1/3 of that country. They occupy a considerable chunk of Syria as well. Would there have been an Islamic State if the United States had not invaded Iraq?
It's hard to say. I mean, certainly the invasion was something that led to the creation of al-Qaeda in Iraq, so ISIL's predecessor. But I wouldn't say that we can connect ISIL's resurgence all the way back to 2003. I think there are 2 primary factors we've got to examine. One being the sectarian nature of the Abadi government and the marginalization of Iraqi Sunnis by the Shia-dominated government in Baghdad. The other, clearly, is the Syrian civil war and the security vacuum that has opened there and has given ISIL space to set up headquarters in a place like Raqqa.
When you talk about the sectarian nature of Iraq right now, was it a failure on the part of the United States to recognize what kind of backlash there would be from that Sunni minority, which ran the country for a very long time, in the wake of the invasion?
I mean, certainly de-Baathification in retrospect was a pretty disastrous policy. I'm not sure how much we can keep blaming on the United States for the continued ineptitude of the Iraqi government. I mean, at what point does it become the responsibility of the host nation to govern itself and its own territory and its own people?
Peter, who determines U.S. foreign policy? Is it the State Department, the Pentagon, or is it all centralized in the White House?
Well, the White House has a very big say in foreign policy, and that's the disappointment about the Obama administration.
And the reason I ask that question is because if we look at what is going on in the Middle East right now, and we look at the U.S. role in that, and we look at the U.S. influence in that, some of the smartest people work at the State Department. Did they get it wrong?
Yeah, they sure got it wrong. I mean, it was Colin Powell who went before the United Nations and gave the speech that he said was the low point of his career. Right. It's an embarrassment. He went up there. The speech they wanted him to give, it was even worse than the one he finally delivered. But it was a pack of lies. And Colin Powell should have known better. Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, is the main proponent of the invasion of Libya. Look how that has turned out. So the State Department's got a lot of smart people, but smart people can screw things up as well as dumb people. I mean, it's not just the Bush administration and their ignorance and stupidity, don't know the difference between Shiites and Sunnis, when they invade, but it's also the smart people, and it's part of the hubris, and it's part of a worldview. Hillary Clinton is as smart as they come, but her worldview is very militaristic, and she still looks to military solutions to problems that don't have military solutions. And that's a mistake that the United States has been making throughout the Cold War.
She is one of the leading candidates to become president in this country.
Yes, she very likely will be the next president of the United States.
So do you think that is going to continue? That she would...
I think she's doubling down on many of the wrong policies, which is why Bob Kagan and other leading neocons have endorsed her, because she's much more in line. Trump, of course, is, what can we say about Donald Trump? He's totally erratic and says one thing one day and the opposite the next day. But on his good days, he sometimes gets things right. And then he'll contradict it the next day. So, of course, you don't want his finger on the nuclear button. Hillary is not likely to involve us in a nuclear war, but she is an interventionist, and she does look first to military solutions to these problems. I mean, I can't find a war that Hillary Clinton doesn't like. She's the old Goldwater girl. She got us involved, or she didn't get us involved. She supported the invasion of Vietnam.
Okay.
I mean, and all the recent ones.
Right, let me get Colin's response on that. Colin, is it going to be more of the same?
It's tough to say. I'm not in the business of forecasting. I'm certainly not going to venture to forecast the next president, and then from there venture what the next president's foreign policy would be.
Andrew, there was a recent poll done by the Pew organization which tells us that more than half of those polled, these were Americans who were polled, believe that military force is the greatest weapon in the war on terror. Now, you're a guy, you've walked the walk, okay?
That's true. And, growing up watching action films, watching the hero run across the open expanse, being shot at by the enemy, bullets pinging around, all of them missing, and then the hero turning around and then taking out everyone who's firing at him with absolute precision. It seems really unrealistic until I've lived it, right? The American military is this amazingly lethal and capable military force. Qua a military, you're not going to find a better military, and we are amazing in a firefight. But nation building, I mean, if we were to go into Syria right now, we would be in the same situation as we were in Iraq. We have this utterly devastated country that we would have to rebuild. We'd have to, with no police force, right? How does the U.S. military police a country where it doesn't speak the language, it doesn't know the culture? So I think where the U.S. military has work to do and has learned a lot of hard lessons over the last decade is how to occupy and rebuild a country. And I think that that's probably the biggest falling that leads to the failures in these wars.
All right, and Tim, if we
I would add, though, that
ahead.
Prevention is the best medicine in this. And if we can avoid creating a situation like we did in Iraq and creating the problem and the Sunni on Shiite violence that the vacuum created, we can go a long way in making a better world. Colin Powell also said, you break it, you buy it. We have got to take responsibility for war prevention as well as the history of war that we have lived so far. Prevention is the best medicine.
And Tim, I want to stay with you for one other point, and this also concerns U.S. public opinion. Is there something called war fatigue in the United States right now? We know, for instance, that President Obama is very reluctant to get involved in any major way in the Syrian civil war. We remember that when he announced that famous or infamous red line and then didn't go there. So now the United States administration relies on things like special forces, small numbers of soldiers that go into these countries. They rely on drones. Is that because the American people have just said, we've had enough of war?
Well, I hope it is. The Iraq war was a complete disaster, particularly for those who were touched by it personally. But our status abroad was devastated. Winning back the trust of people after large strategic mistakes like that is a very difficult prospect. So whether it's war fatigue or people beginning to see what the reality of war is for the civilian population, for those who are asked to fight in the wars and come home devastated, these are hopefully getting through to the American people. I'm not holding my breath, but I am hopeful.
Right, and Colin, if we look ahead to how this war is going to be handled, what the future administration is going to do, let's take, for instance, the United States' relationship with Saudi Arabia. Now, the U.S. tells us very often that it acts in its own interests. However unpalatable that relationship might be, it is an ally in the United States. Is it time now for the United States to get tough with an ally like Saudi Arabia and say, look, you know, we have evidence that you are financing a lot of these terror groups. It needs to stop.
Well, I think that's something that the U.S. has been doing for quite some time, that has been putting pressure on the government in Riyadh, on the Kuwaitis, on the Qataris, and others, that wherever they've seen evidence that these governments or individuals loosely connected to the governments have been financing terrorism. So certainly that's part of it. I think part of what the Obama administration intended, especially in its second term, was to pivot to Asia, was to move away from the Middle East altogether. But here we are once again stuck in this seemingly endless quagmire where we can't quite extract the United States and the military from that region because it's too geostrategically important. And so there we are. I don't expect the next administration, whoever it is, to withdraw wholesale just because it is so important.
Peter, I just want to get back to something that our reporter talked about right at the beginning of the show, and that is this new threat, which is the homegrown terrorist. How does that change the war on terrorism?
How have homegrown terrorists? I think that the war on terrorism has increased the threat of homegrown terrorists. I mean, it looks to the world as if the United States is fighting a war against Islam. I mean, that's not what the policy is supposed to be, but we've been overthrowing and invading secular Islamic country after secular Islamic country. We've bombed, what, in recent years, 7 Islamic countries.
Well, Andrew Basovich, who's a former military man, has actually written a piece in which he says that
the Taliban were not secular in Afghanistan.
Well, he said
far from it.
Bombed or invaded or occupied 14 countries.
14, but that goes back.
Yeah.
Basovich's piece goes back several years, and it says we've invaded, bombed, or occupied 14 different Islamic countries. To the world, we look at the Times Square bomber.
Right.
Remember when he was asked by the judge how you could detonate a bomb or consider detonating a bomb that was going to kill innocent women and children? And he said, well, what do you think America's drones do in Pakistan? He says, they're killing innocent women and children in Pakistan. And so in the mindset of certain people, they equate what the United States is doing with what they're doing here, and they think it's a justification. Of course it's not, and there are a lot of, but if you go back to the earlier periods, there was a secular response and a political response to U.S. foreign policy. Now a lot of that has turned into this kind of a religious fanaticism, which is in many ways much more dangerous and less constructive.